All right, cool. I am on my way to go get my daughter. um, I'm on my way to go get my daughter, and I wanted to take this time to make the argument that mainstream neuroscientists and their philosophic allies, like John Searle, for example, are closet Cartesian dualists. Now, what I'm specifically talking about is what is called emergentism. So this is the idea, and this is the most mainstream idea in neuroscience and a lot of philosophy, is the idea that certain things happen in the brain and that consciousness emerges from this, from this brain activity. Ooh, we're a little bit tight in here. There we go. And this is something that just people take for granted. Particularly most neuroscientists just take it for granted. And the fact that we don't actually know how this emergence happens, a lot of folks just say, well, give us time and we'll figure it out. And they generally, and you will see a lot of videos on like YouTube, contrasting emergentism from Cartesian dualism, and they see it as a totally different thing. In fact, I've seen a lot of videos that will say, well, you basically have two philosophic options. There is dualism, there is dualism, and there is emergentism, and these are two options. Now, I'm going to argue that not only are those not the only two options on the table, but actually, from a broader perspective, they're really just the same thing. That emergentism, like what John Searle promotes, is it's a modernization or a new version. It's just Cartesian dualism sort of gift wrapped in modern materialist scientific language, but it's really not that different. So, not when you put it into the wider philosophic context and include other options, which a lot of people, it's just not on there. Those other options aren't on their radar, or they see them as needlessly avant-garde or like new agey and lame. Okay, so what did Descartes say, right? So Descartes, and we should say that Descartes, like, he didn't really invent all of this stuff, but he's the symbol that we often use for this point of view. So this is the idea that you've got a physical body existing in a physical universe, and that you have a soul or a consciousness that it probably, the way Descartes would say, is that it existed prior to that body being born and being created in the earthly realm, but that the soul, and remember, when in this context, when we say soul, we're saying soul and individuated consciousness or identity, conscious identity is all just the same thing. So the body is born, and then the soul, which already existed, comes from like a different universe, heaven or something, and is sort of beamed into the body. And then it lives out its life being sort of like a living in the body, but it is a separate thing from the body. And then after death, it goes somewhere else. Now, this is contrasted to emergentism, right? The emergentism says that the consciousness emerges out of a particular brain state. Things happen in the brain. We don't really understand them, but when those things happen, the consciousness happens. And it is individuated, meaning it is the individual and the unit and lots of these things. And it happens in the brain. that Descartes would pretty much agree with that. Well, he might have said the heart or just the body in general, but it doesn't really matter. In any case, the consciousness exists in the body, and everybody has their own, and it's completely individual. And it floats around in space, as opposed to the physical world happening in consciousness, or the physical world and consciousness being the same thing, or something along those lines, like in panpsychism or idealism, or like non-dual mysticism. Okay, so here's the thing, though, and here's the point that I'm trying to make, is that while the modern emergentist has a different story for how the soul gets created, and does the soul die at death? They've got a different story for that. Why does it exist? It exists for some kind of evolutionary purpose. So their story for why it exists it exists in a different theology, basically. But here's my point, is that the thing itself, the story around the soul, is very different, but the underlying description, the ontology of the soul itself, is basically the same. It's you. It is unique to you. There is lots of them. Every person has a separate consciousness, and it exists in space, and it floats around, somehow tied to the brain. And Descartes and John Searle completely agree on that. And to me, that is the essence of dualism. Like, if you think that the body and the soul, or the body and consciousness, are two different things, I mean, emergentists call themselves materialists, and they'll say, well, it emerges, or it is, but it doesn't matter. The fact is that even if the brain is creating consciousness, it is still a separate thing, right? The relationship between consciousness and the body that emergentists believe in, and the relationship between the body and the soul that Descartes believes in, really isn't actually very different from a descriptive, phenomenological kinds of point of view. Like, the ontology, that they're describing is basically the same. The thing itself is basically the same. It's only the narrative around the thing itself that is different. And this is where I think the problem lies, is I just don't think the Descartes soul exists fundamentally. It's not that we need a sciencey explanation for why it exists. It's that the thing doesn't exist at all. You cut open the brain and there's no soul there. That's why scientists can't find it. But the thing is that they haven't been versed in Eastern philosophy. A lot of them have never taken psychedelics. They're not familiar with the mystical traditions. And so they just don't know that other options are on the table, right? So for example, the modern panpsychist idea, there's more than one panpsychist idea, but it goes something like this, that the universe at the lowest level is conscious, or rather is consciousness, and that the physical world is a modulation of that conscious field. This is a completely, radically different ontology. Like, the referent that we would be looking for, if we're looking for consciousness, if we take that idea, then what we're looking for, the thing itself, is radically different than Descartes. As opposed to what emergentists are doing, they're just looking for Descartes' soul. They don't know it because they don't know the other options. They haven't thought about the other options, but they're essentially Cartesian dualists, and they're just looking for the soul within the physical realm, and they're not finding it.